important questions for Christians and skeptics, and really anybody to ask today. Can we trust the New Testament as being reliable? Now, it turns out that there's a lot of people who've been making this case for a long time, but it also turns out that there's a lot of myths and mistakes that have been passed on by apologists, by pastors, but also by those who are more skeptical. And today we want to get the record straight. I don't know anybody who's more qualified or interested to talk about this than my friend Peter Gurry, who's the author. He's a professor at Phoenix Seminary, the author of a book that I highly recommend called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. We're going to unpack this book today. I'm going to ask him the toughest questions I can come up with, and we're going to try to make time for questions at the end. But first, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have a number of interviews coming up with people like Stephen Meyer, Os Guinness, Randy Alcorn, dealing with some of the most important apologetics issues today. Dr. Peter Gurry, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, it's great to be here with you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
So tell me first your interest in textual criticism. Actually, let's start with, tell us just what textual criticism is in case people are watching that don't know. Then I'll know your story that motivated you to care about this.
Sure. Well, like most people, I didn't really know what text criticism was either. So, but real quickly, text criticism is the attempt to recover the original text of a writing that's been lost, where the original's been lost. So, in the case of the New Testament, we don't have what's called the autographs, the original documents that say Paul wrote to the Romans. But we have copies of it, and those copies don't always agree with each other. So we have to try to sort out the differences and decide which one is most likely the earliest or original reading at every place where they disagree. And really my interest in it started in high school, where it started because I did not want to take Spanish. That really is the simple reason.
Okay. You'd have to tell me a little bit more than
that.
Yeah,
I'm going to fill in some gaps there. So when I went to high school, I had the chance to take Spanish or Greek. And wow. I was the youngest of 5 kids, and I always hated doing what everybody else did. And everybody else pretty much took Spanish in my family. So I decided, hey, I'll sign up to take Greek. And 4 years later, I had had 4 years of Koine Greek and had developed a real fascination with the fact that my English Bible that I had grown up with had something behind it. I kind of just grown up and all I ever knew was the English Bible. I just kind of assumed that's all there was. And then I realized there was a Greek New Testament behind that. And so went off to Bible college, actually with the intention of doing Bible translation. And it was while I was there that I was still studying Greek that I discovered textual criticism and realized that if behind my English Bible there was a Greek New Testament, then behind my printed Greek New Testament there was a whole large number of hand-copied manuscripts. And so it was really just this continuing fascination with kind of wanting to go further and further behind the veil of my English Bible and say, well, what's really back there? What's really back there? And so textual criticism was just a fascination for me. It was kind of, to me, it felt like the closest I could get to the words of the original authors. And so I wanted to work with that. And then I also had a fascination with the manuscripts too, as manuscripts, their formatting, how they're copied. I mean, we take the printed book so for granted today. You just crack it open, or an electronic book maybe. But to imagine a world where any book you want to read has to be copied by hand, that was just fascinating to me. So that's the short version.
That's great. By the way, for our audience, this isn't just for biblical writers. This is for all ancient writers. It's the same process to do our best to reconstruct what the originals wrote. I love hearing in high school you're studying interested in Greek. What a fascinating story. Now that brings us to your book, which I've said to many people, to pastors, to apologists, just to lay leaders that want to know why the Bible's true. Your book really is a gift to the church. And again, it's called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. And we're going to walk through some of these chapters and myths that are made today and how we can best make the case for the New Testament. But tell me and our viewers, what motivated you to write this book kind of at this stage?
Yeah. So, I finished my PhD in this discipline just a couple years ago. And as a Christian, I'd always been interested in the reliability of the Bible. And because I was interested in text criticism, I was naturally interested in that aspect of the question of the reliability of the Bible. And I just kind of kept seeing that that popular apologists often had to rely on outdated information when they talked about this specific issue. And so it just struck me that, most of the people they were getting their information from weren't trained in textual criticism. And I knew from personal experience just how technical the discipline can be. So even other New Testament scholars like yourself, Sean, they will often look at text criticism as like, that's the field where the nerds of the nerds go, right? So like a normal New Testament
compliment to say the nerds.
Well, it depends on the person saying it, Sean. It really does.
I'm just saying, I've got a Biola Star Wars shirt on, so being called a nerd isn't necessarily bad.
I would say usually it's not a compliment.
Okay.
But usually it's something, Sean. It'll be said something like, I don't really like textual criticism, but I'm glad that there are people that do it.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed.
So it was once compared to the person that comes and cleans the gutters. Right.
Wow.
In the old days. Right. Something that you don't want to do yourself, but somebody's got to do it. So I just have always had a fascination with it and realized it is something that needs to be done. So I wanted to do it. So during my PhD, I just thought, what apologists need is a good resource that actually corrects some of the misinformation on our own side. Right. Yeah. It's one thing to write another book against Bart Ehrman, but I thought, that's already been done 4 or 5 times. I think there's plenty good responses to him, and that's been done. But what we need, because of the responses to him, is we actually need to kind of tone back some things, dial some things back and say, actually, we've gotten some things wrong now, right? In responding to Bart Ehrman, we've actually sometimes overstated the evidence for our case or misstated it.
That's great.
So it was really designed to be a resource.
Very similar to my doctoral dissertation on the fate of the apostles, realizing that we had oversold some of the deaths of the apostles. We can still make this argument, but let's be more careful how we do it. Yeah. Now, when I read your book, I got to be honest with you, when I picked it up, I had a little bit of fear and trembling, knowing that you would be critiquing evidence that demands a verdict and just feeling like, oh man, am I going to get my clock cleaned here? But I was pleasantly surprised. Yeah. Tell me some of the thoughts reading the evidence. I'd just be curious to know. Yeah,
sure. So yes, we mentioned evidence that demands a verdict a few times. And actually, we were pleasantly surprised when we came to the kind of the final edits of the book. The second edition, or I guess maybe not the second edition, but the edition that you and your dad did together had come out just a year or two before. And so we realized we actually needed to check that edition and interact with that one. And we were pleasantly surprised at a number of points where the rhetoric had been dialed back. So like on first century Mark, for example, we were really, really happy to see the caution on that, right? And that was, I think, one that for apologists, first century Mark, which we all know now is not first century.
Yeah.
That was just like, it was too good to be true. And so a lot of popular apologists, I think, ran with it too early and ended up getting burned by it a bit. And so things like that were actually the update that you and your dad did. We were pleasantly surprised. But, I was telling you before we started that nobody comes off completely clean in this book.
That's right.
So if you read the footnotes carefully, you'll notice that both of the editors get criticized at various points for misstatements as well. So, nobody's immune.
I think you guys had a real desire to help the church, but some integrity as well, which is just desperately needed. Yeah. Well, I see some questions coming in the side. If you'll hold just for a little bit, because I think a lot of these questions are going to get answered as we start working through this. In the introduction, you talk about how misinformation on the side of those who want to defend the Bible is sometimes more severe than critics. And you give a few examples. For example, you talk about how apologists will use outdated information, and sometimes in reference to like F.F. Bruce's, are the New Testament documents reliable? So unpack that a little bit for us if you can.
Yeah. So this, I think, is one of the temptations. As apologists, we believe that Christianity is true, and we don't just believe it's true, but we believe it's good, right? And so we naturally want we want to convince people. We want people to see the goodness and beauty and truth of Christianity. And the temptation can be that we go out and find whatever argument is most compelling, and then we use that, and we don't take the time to do due diligence to see if the argument really stands up, right? Okay. So this is the danger of apologetics that we have to constantly be careful about. And so the F.F. Bruce example is a classic one, I think, because what happens is apologists come to the number of manuscripts for the New Testament, and they want to find the latest, biggest number they can find, right? Okay. So if they find a number that says 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament, that's the one they're going to go with, right? But then when it comes to finding the number of manuscripts for a classical document, they'll go back and read F.F. Bruce, whose data is now 50, 60 years old, and they'll continue to cite him without realizing that, hey, in 50, 60 years, we've discovered and cataloged and studied more classical manuscripts as well. And so those numbers have gone up. So what you end up getting is a comparison that's unbalanced and unfair. And it's because we've actually been biased in favor of the New Testament. We pull the biggest number we can find for that without doing due diligence to say, well, what's the latest number for the classical authors that we're citing, right?
Now, this issue wasn't as big of a deal in the past because nobody could check the numbers. Now people can check the numbers, so it undermines our attempt to show that the Bible's true.
That's right. And part of the issue with that argument is, what are we really trying to prove with that? If we have 10 times the number of manuscripts, that doesn't itself mean the New Testament is reliable, right? You can have 1,000 manuscripts that are 1,000 bad manuscripts, and that doesn't necessarily help you at all, right?
Good.
And even then, do we need classical works to be unreliable in order for the New Testament to be reliable?
Right.
Well, no. It's actually, we can quite happily live in a world where they're both reliable, So you just have to, part of it is thinking through the nature of the argument itself and what it can and can't work for, what it can and can't do for us.
That's great. So the first mistake you mentioned is outdated information. A second one you mentioned is abuse of statistics. And now you're critiquing on both sides, but Ehrman would famously say there's 400,000 variants in a text. If you compare that to the 138,000 words that are in the New Testament, there could be a different word for every 2 or 3 other words. You unpack why this is unhelpful and inaccurate. Walk us through that a little bit.
So it's Ehrman likes to say there are more variants than there are words in your New Testament, which makes it sound like, oh goodness, then we can't ever know what it says, right? Which is just kind of there's a logical problem there, but he is right numerically that are we still there?
We are still there. Yep.
My screensaver came on for a second.
Oh, no worries.
I like to say it's the one point where Ehrman is more conservative than I am.
Okay.
Because he gives 400,000 variants, and I actually tried to count and then extrapolate from the count, and so there's probably like 500,000 of them.
And if I can cut in, those are distinctly Greek.
That's
Greek
correct.
manuscripts.
That's
right?
Correct. So this is one of the problems, and this is a problem with Ehrman. It's a problem with everybody who gives these estimates. Nobody ever really tells us what they're counting. So maybe one scholar thinks he's counting all variants in Greek manuscripts. Another scholar thinks he's estimating the number of variants in Greek, Syriac, Latin, and all the other versions of the New Testament that we have, right? Well, those are two very different things, right? So I try to be real careful and say it's 500,000 estimated variants in Greek manuscripts alone. So I'm not counting patristic citations. I'm not counting variants that are in Latin or variants that are in Syriac, which, we have variants in those as well. But then the crucial thing is to think through, okay, but what kinds of variants are there? So that's the bare number. How many of them matter? And I like to give the example of John chapter 18, where we know there are about 3,000 variants in our 1,600 plus Greek manuscripts for John 18. And there's only about 800 words in John 18. Okay, so a lot more variants to words, a lot more variants than words. But if you look at those variants, how many of them make it into my Greek New Testament that I use as a scholar? The answer is a couple hundred. And then if you look in the Greek New Testament that's designed just for Bible translators, there's like a dozen. Okay, and then if you look at the footnotes and say the ESV or even like the Net Bible, which the Net Bible has tons of footnotes, right? If you've ever used the Net Bible, it has tons of footnotes. There's none. None of them are discussed. If you look at a commentary like C.K. Barrett, I think he discusses like 8, and none of them are especially hard to resolve. So that just puts in perspective that we have a lot of variants, but most of them are very easy to resolve. They're very easy to figure out what the original reading is. Or in some cases where they're not easy to resolve, they don't really affect the meaning notably, right? Okay. So the simplest way to tell how many variants matter to say an English Bible reader is to pay attention to your footnotes in your English Bible. Like these things, and this is a big part of it, right? People, when they learn about this, the first reaction often is, I've been lied to.
Wow.
Right? The wool's been pulled over my eyes and I'm being deceived. All along there's all these variants in my Bible and nobody's told me about them. And the short answer is no, you do know about them if you pay attention, right? Just read the footnotes. Now, I know most people don't read the footnotes in their Bible. Okay.
I'm not sure how many people read their Bibles, but that's
there
a
you go.
separate
Okay,
issue.
We can start there. No, absolutely. Let's start there. But the most important variants are already in your English Bible footnotes. So just look there and see. And you can tell for yourself how significant do you think they are or not.
Now, one of the things that your book kind of kicked me in the rear, I thought, oh man, I got to state that more clearly, is these are non-spelling variants.
That's true. No, that's true.
I thought 75-80% of these were spelling, but they're non-spelling. And one of the examples I'll give, and you comment on this, is the beginning of Mark. Yeah. And Mark starts out and talks about this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then there's a statement, the Son of God. And there's differences whether that statement is in Mark 1:1 or not. So your point in the book is this isn't a question about orthodoxy, what Mark teaches about Jesus and his identity. It's whether or not a scribe came along later and added that for clarity at the beginning. So could you talk about that example and then what the variants mean for core theological doctrines being at stake?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in Mark 1:1, it reads, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. All right. However, in some important manuscripts, we don't have the phrase "Son of God," and so this has been one of those variants that is hard to resolve and does affect the meaning. Okay, so it's been debated quite a lot by New Testament scholars, and there are good arguments on both sides of this. Okay, I happen to think that "Son of God" is original for various reasons that we can get into if you want. But let's go to your question about how much does it affect, right? And this is one that I think Ehrman will sometimes appeal to and say, hey, this gives us a different Jesus in Mark's gospel. And I want to say, well, no, that's overstating it, because you don't have to even get out of the first chapter of Mark where we have the voice from heaven at the baptism saying, this is my beloved, what? Son, right? So clearly Jesus is the Son of God right from the first chapter. And then, of course, climactically in Mark, Mark's gospel climaxes with the soldier at the cross saying, surely this man was the Son of God, right? And then the demons say that at various points throughout. And so Son of God is actually a very important theme in Mark's gospel. And the question that the variant touches on is whether Mark starts the first verse with that or not, right? But it's clear that by the first chapter, we as readers know this about Jesus, and Mark wants us to read the gospel through that lens. So I wouldn't ever say that this variant doesn't matter, right? But it certainly doesn't change whether or not the New Testament teaches that Jesus is the Son of God.
Good.
It doesn't even change whether Mark teaches whether Jesus is the Son of God.
That's good.
Right? So it affects the start of Mark's gospel, sure, but it doesn't affect Mark's gospel, and certainly doesn't affect the question of whether Jesus is actually the Son of God or not, right? Yeah.
Peter, I'm going to throw a question at you that I didn't prep you with ahead of time. That I want to know is that after I read your book, I thought, gosh, I need to be so careful how I make a case for the New Testament. And I find this tension saying, I want to make the case as strong as I can because I believe it's true and I believe it's defensible. But I also, in an audience, sometimes I'll say things like, in Evidence Demands Verdict, we have a statement where we say, archaeology is one way to support a larger case for the New Testament. And some people are like, that's it? Archaeology doesn't prove it completely?
Prove it. Yeah, right.
And so some people are disappointed because I try to nuance things carefully.
Yeah.
So for apologists that work with non-scholars, what's your advice for putting forward a strong hand without people finding these variants and in turn being disappointed, feeling like we didn't present the truth to them?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I think there's a lot we could say about that. One thing I would say, though, is as an apologist, you need to keep in mind the long game. Okay, and so what may work great with an audience tonight, you have to ask yourself the question: it may work tonight, but is it actually going to hurt us in the long run? Okay, so it's not just about you and your audience tonight. It's about the Christian faith, right? And certainly in principle, as Christians, we care about the truth, right? So we're not just interested in what works and what gets people excited or whatever. We're interested in what's actually true. And then I'd say that maybe the third thing in terms of just strategy is oftentimes a more narrow argument is stronger. And so keep that in mind. Sometimes you can actually, kind of like an arrow, right? The sharpest point of the arrow is the narrowest point, and that's the part that actually works the best, right? So try to find the strongest argument you can make and focus on that and make it really strongly. And don't worry if not every piece of evidence out there supports your case or not. That's okay. So take the strongest argument you can make, but also be fair and honest. And I think, especially, and I'm sure, Sean, you know this, working with high schoolers and young people so much, young people rightly care a lot about authenticity.
I agree.
Right? And they know, after a while, they know if we're just blowing smoke. Yeah. And so actually it wins us a lot of credibility with our audiences if we can be upfront and say, look, here's a problem for my view. Here's why it's not fatal, right? Okay. Here's why it's not fatal to my view, but I don't, this piece of evidence is a bit of a challenge or just doesn't completely support my view, right? It's ambiguous or whatever. I think that actually can go a long way with young people who don't necessarily need us to have the evidence 100% nailed down every single time, and we're always right, and there isn't even an ounce of doubt. You know what I mean?
That's really helpful and wise. I think this generation resonates when we're just honest with them.
Right.
They can get a million opinions on the other side of somebody trying to sell them something.
Right.
The evidence is strong enough. Right. Let's state it as it is.
And I think it's partly, Sean, it's just a matter of it's always fine to say, I don't know. Like I got questions about the New Testament, about the Bible that I don't have good, clean answers to. Doesn't mean I lose my faith over them. I sometimes say to people, if half of what the Bible says is true, then my goodness, your whole world is turned upside down. If the resurrection is true, then some of these other questions I have are trifles.
Preach it, brother. Amen. Hey, a few people have commented on this in the section, is the Mark Fragment.
Yes.
So talk about, just in case some listeners aren't aware of this, how it first came up, some of the misstatements about it, and maybe lessons we can learn in the church from some of the mistakes tied to this Mark Fragment. Yeah,
that was a great question. All right, so we can't recount the whole story, but if folks want to, Google it because it's a fascinating story. And apparently one of the main people behind the whole problem may or may not be in jail right now as a result of this. Okay, so people should know this is a big deal. Okay, I'll start with the lessons though. The main lesson we can learn from it is wait till something is published to use it as evidence for Christianity. Okay, so when a manuscript is discovered, all right, we can talk about what discovery means, but when a manuscript is discovered, it has to go through a vetting process. Okay, and just because one scholar immediately thinks it should be dated to 2nd century doesn't mean that later more careful scrutiny won't show that it's actually a different century. Okay. And then here's another important lesson. Earlier is not always better.
Okay.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
So if Mark, like we know now that the Mark Fragment is 2nd or 3rd century, does that mean Mark's gospel is less reliable than it would have been if that fragment had been 1st century? The answer is no. Right? We actually didn't learn anything real significant about the text of Mark's gospel from this fragment. Okay. So yeah, it would have been, at one level, it would have been fantastic and fascinating to have a 1st century New Testament fragment. But on another level, the New Testament didn't become any more or less reliable because of that fragment. Okay. So, and here's the way to think about this. Before we discovered the papyri over the last 100+ years, were Christians on bad logical grounds or historical grounds to trust the New Testament? My answer is no, they weren't. Okay, so the fact that so I think we just want to be careful at saying like, well, this one fragment, if we can just get this one fragment, now Christianity will be proved true. Well, but what does that imply about previous generations? That they didn't have good evidence for the New Testament, right?
That's a great question.
Part of it's just a matter of getting things in their proper proportion, right, and not being overbearing on things. So, and then I would say, okay, so the Mark Fragment, here's what happened essentially. All right, this is what we now know. Okay, we now know that Dirk Abink, who was the director of a very significant collection of ancient papyri at the University of Oxford, was more than likely trying to steal papyri from that collection and sell them to people at the Museum of the Bible. Okay, and one of the fragments that he took out of that collection that was not his to take was this fragment. And at some point, he told them that he thought it was from the 1st century.
Okay.
And that information got passed on to Dan Wallace, who is my teacher and professor and mentor at Dallas Seminary. And Dan shared it in a debate with Bart Ehrman. And from there, it exploded.
I remember that.
You remember, yeah. It's hard to forget. And then the problem was Dan had thought it was going to be published very soon. Well, that turned out not to be the case, right? And in fact, when it ended up getting published, it surprised all of us who had been following it that it was published in this Oxford collection as part of it, because all of us had thought for sure that the Museum of the Bible was going to own it, and then they didn't. And so that's what started this trail of questions about, well, what happened here? And that's how we discovered that, sure enough, it was an attempted theft. Okay, so then the other part about it is, again, it had been proclaimed as a first century Mark fragment, and a lot of apologists got excited about this and thought that they could use this as evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Right, it proved that they were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses.
Yep.
Okay. And so that became part of a larger argument about the reliability of the Gospels and the resurrection of Jesus. Well, it turned out when Dirk Abink, who was one of the publishers of the papyrus, when he finally published it, he decided no, it was more likely to be 2nd or 3rd century, not from the 1st century. And that's probably right. There's all kinds of reasons to be skeptical about a 1st century fragment. It could certainly happen, but it would be really unlikely that we'd have a 1st century copy of the New Testament.
And is that just because of the age and how few copies there were in the 1st century?
That's right. That's right. So let's say, even if you date Mark to say AD 40 rather than something like AD 65, you've only got 60 years for it to be copied before you're in the 2nd century, right? And there just weren't that many copies. And it just so happens that Mark is the one gospel of the 4 that we have the least copies of early on.
Interesting.
And there's reasons for that. It's probably because Mark is largely incorporated into Matthew, right? If you got to go through the expense of copying a gospel in the 1st and 2nd century, do you want Mark or do you want Mark plus? Do you want Mark? You want Mark with the special bonus features at the end of the video? Yeah, you do, right? So if you're going to go to the trouble of making a copy, you're more likely to copy Matthew rather than Mark. So that's probably one reason why we have more copies of the other ones than Mark, for example. So, but yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell the 1st century Mark.
That really helps. I took on the word of people that I trust that this was a 1st century fragment, and probably some people took it from me that they trust. Yeah. And I've learned, you know what, like you said, I'm going to wait and hold off until we know with confidence. So I think there's a lot of lessons that have been learned from this. Yeah. Talk to me about how we date manuscripts, because one of the things reading through this book, I was amazed that some we can narrow down to a few decades. Some it's like a century and a half is the smallest window. So how do we actually date manuscripts? Yeah,
that's a good question. So it remains true that the most reliable way to date manuscripts is based on the style of handwriting. Okay, and this may seem odd, but it's only odd because most of us only ever encounter one period of English handwriting that we're familiar with. But if I were to show you, say, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, you would immediately realize, oh, that's old, right? You may not know how old, but you would know that was not written recently. And in a similar way that English handwriting has changed over time, Greek handwriting changed over time as well. And so once we get some pinpointed manuscripts where, say, the scribe has told us when he wrote, or there's some other means of dating it accurately, we can use those as hooks on a wall that we can then string other manuscripts on and kind of chart a development of handwriting. Okay. Now, the reason why you can't be very precise with that is because one scribe may work for 50 years. Okay. So you've got at least a 50-year window usually before handwriting develops into some kind of new form. Okay. That's usually the window that paleographers, that's the technical term for people who date handwriting. Paleographers usually are very reticent to go any narrower than 50 years.
50 years, right? So 25 in front, 25 behind.
That's right. And see, the problem is what happens with something like P52, one of our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. People see a date range, and then they maybe either pick the earliest part of that or maybe the midpoint. And it's easy to give people the wrong impression that the midpoint is the date it was actually copied. Okay. Which it's not, right? We don't know that. That's just the midpoint of the full range. So I often like to just give the whole century. I just think that's the best way. Just give the whole century.
So let's talk about P52 for a minute. And some in our audience will recognize that by its number. Some will think, what on earth are you talking about? Yeah. So talk about what that is, its significance, and why you date that, if I'm correct, from 8100 to 200 is the narrowest range you give.
Yeah, so P52 is the name that's given to a very small manuscript of John's Gospel. and the P stands for papyrus because that's the material it's written on. And then 52 means it's the 52nd papyrus that was cataloged. Okay, so that's all the 52 means. It's kept in a library in Manchester, England, and it's still considered the earliest or one of the earliest copies we have of the New Testament. So it gets a lot of fanfare, and for good reason. But again, because we're dating it primarily, in fact, in this case, entirely on handwriting, on the style of writing, it's best to say, look, it's 2nd century, right? Okay. Rather than saying it's AD 125. Because again, if a scribe works for 50 years, then you have at least 50 years, and then it's not a perfect science, and it's not like the script changes every 50 years on the 50-year mark, right? So actually you can have a style of handwriting that lasts easily for a century or more, because one scribe passes that style of handwriting on to his understudy, for example.
So this is a portion of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, correct? Yep. And it's believed to be the earliest physical manuscript we have of any New Testament writing, especially the Gospels.
Right.
Now, the typical comparison that's made is say, hey, look at Herodotus, look at Josephus, look at these other writers. We have 500, 700, 1,000 years removed.
Yeah.
How significant do you think it is to have that portion that if it's 100 to 200, could be a decade or could be a century and a decade?
Right.
How significant is having that in your mind to reconstructing the original?
Oh, okay. Okay, for that particular question, not very much at all, honestly. I mean, we get a handful of verses out of this manuscript because it's like a credit card size, right? So what's the significance of it is that it's early, and the real significance is that when it was published, it was taken as proof that John's gospel was from the 1st century, not from the 2nd century. That's really the main thing. The main way it's been leveraged in New Testament scholarship, and that is important because some scholars wanted to date John's gospel in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
And P52 was pretty significant in changing a lot of people's minds. Now, whether it should or not, I don't think John's gospel should be dated the 2nd century no matter what. But P52 did change some people's mind. And if P52 can be dated anywhere in the 2nd century, well, then it's not as strong an argument for that. Does that make sense?
Yep, it
does. So, yeah, maybe there's some loss there, I guess, for us. But I think you can argue the earlier date for John's gospel on better grounds. I don't think we really need P52, frankly.
Okay, fair enough. What are the other manuscripts that would be considered competitors or close to P52 as possibly being the earliest?
Yeah, oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot.
And, we can come back to that. I did not prep you for that question. There's a whole lot of manuscripts.
It's P something. It's P1 something.
Don't worry about the specific numbers.
If people go to the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog, it's on there. But here's an important fact, okay? And again, I said earlier is not always better. I mean, early is great. And any manuscript that's early is great because it tells us something, right? There's all kinds of things that we learn from manuscripts, like did the scribe abbreviate sacred names, and which names did he abbreviate, and what's the style of handwriting, and are there new variants in this manuscript and things like that. But give me a good 12th century manuscript of the New Testament, and guess what I have? A good manuscript of the New Testament. I mean, the other day I was working in the Church Fathers. I forget. I think it was Clement of Alexandria, who's like a 2nd century church father, and one of his writings we have like 2 or 3 medieval manuscripts for his text. And patristic scholars don't complain about that. That's what they got, so they work with what they've got, and they're happy to work with that. I'm glad the Bible is not based on such thin evidence, but you can have a 12th century manuscript that's really, really good. And that, I guess that's the point, is to say it's not necessarily about early and more. It's about good. It's about quality over quantity.
So how do you determine good then? If it's not in your mind earlier and more, how would we know that?
Right. So, and remember, it's not that early is bad. It's just that it's not necessarily better. Okay. Oftentimes it is, but not necessarily. I would say that the best way is by doing text criticism. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means where manuscripts disagree with each other, we ask ourselves questions like, okay, which manuscript has the reading that's more likely to be the creation of a scribe? Okay, And scribes are not likely to make the text more unclear, for example. They're more likely to smooth out the text. So if there's a little bit of an ambiguity in the text, they're more likely to remove ambiguity than to add it. Okay. If they add ambiguity, it's usually by accident. It's usually a slip of the pen. Okay. So we look at things like that, like, well, what are scribes most likely to do? And there's a whole set of criteria that we use to try to determine that. Things like, what is standard Greek grammar, and then how does Greek grammar change later, such that scribes might want to update the grammar to the way they wrote and spoke later on. Okay, are there parallel passages? We know from the Gospels, for example, that scribes were tempted at times to make Matthew sound more like Mark.
Okay,
right? Not necessarily even intentionally. It might have just been they had just copied Matthew's Gospel. Now they're copying Mark, or the other way around. And so the one is familiar in their mind, and so they change the one to fit the other one, for example, right? The most common mistakes, of course, are simply things like changing one word for another, changing the tense of a verb, changing simple conjunctions in Greek, right, that overlap in meaning, or leaving words out by accident because the words end with the same ending. And that's a real easy mistake for scribes to make.
This is the nitty gritty work you're talking about that people don't want to do, but you can look across these scribes and make assessments of what's more likely original and what's made up. So one of the criticisms that Ehrman and others have raised is, even if our first copy, say P52, small portion of John, you get into the second century, I think there's 6 manuscripts or so. And as you go over the centuries, we get more and more manuscripts. But they're still removed complete manuscripts by at least a couple centuries plus.
Right.
How do we know it wasn't corrupted in that window before we have these manuscripts?
Right. So that's a good question. And I think one way to address that question is to turn it back on the person who's asking it, okay? And say, well, how do you know it was?
Okay.
So if Ehrman says we can't know what the original text of the New Testament is, then I would just say to him, well, then you don't know it's been corrupted. I mean, there's scribal mistakes in the manuscripts we have, but that doesn't mean that my printed edition that's based on scholarly work isn't exactly word for word the original, because you're saying you don't know what that is, right? In other words, one way to answer that is to say your skepticism doesn't have to be mine.
Okay.
And just not even go there with them, frankly, right? I think that's one way. And then the other thing I would say is, well, because when we compare the manuscripts to each other, we just so often don't see significant changes. So things like, the big ones, like the ending of Mark's Gospel. We have the ending of Mark's Gospel and the woman caught in adultery, and we have a variant at the end of Romans, the conclusion of Romans, which is interesting. And that's about it as far as big textual changes, right? And so you have to ask yourself the question, if these things were wholesale corrupted, we'd probably have some evidence for it, some kind of, sign that this had happened. So, for example, I like to give the example of Codex Bezae, which is a 5th century copy of the Gospels and Acts, and it has a little bit of one of the Johannine letters in it. And it's a funky manuscript. Like, it's got a lot of funky readings in it. And to me, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule.
Okay.
Right? Like, we know it's weird. How do we know it's weird? Because it looks so different from everything else. Right? So if everything else looks similar or different from Codex Bezae, I can either assume, well, they're all corrupt, or I can assume that no, just one of them is messed up.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And so where manuscripts agree, I just don't think there's any reason to doubt that they preserve the original text. Right? Why would I doubt them?
I think the way you put it in the book was, it's possible, but it's not reasonable to conclude that.
Yeah.
And I think
the other thing I think you could say, Sean, is Think, for example, the Gospels, okay? Eventually, the Gospels came to be copied together, almost always. So at a certain point from, say, 3rd century on, the Gospels always come as the 4 Gospels. But before that, they must have been copied separately at first. So what you have at some point is actually a dual trajectory, where you have Mark's Gospel being copied as Mark's Gospel by itself, and then eventually it's incorporated into the other 4 and copied with those. And how, if Mark's Gospel begins to be copied around the Roman Empire, how are you going to change all of those? Right? I mean,
that's a great question.
Same with Paul's letters, right? Okay, so he sends the letter to the Romans, okay? And presumably at some point they make a copy to send to another church, which is exactly what Paul tells us in Colossians he wants his churches to do. He wants them to read each other's letters. And so they make a copy and send it to somewhere else. They make a copy and send it to somewhere else. Within a couple of generations, how are you going to manage to change all of those? It's going to be impossible. You can't do that, right? So yes, there are places where corruptions enter, but the important thing is that we have evidence for when they do. And if we have evidence for when they do, then we also have the material to recognize them, right? And that's the key.
There's some great comments and questions coming on. Let me go to one. First off, if you're enjoying this, give us a thumbs up. It just helps with the YouTube metrics for more people to see this and potentially watch it. So give it a thumbs up if you're enjoying this conversation. Pine Creek has a question that I'd love to throw your way, Peter. He says, do you agree that errors increase in the manuscripts the further back in time we go?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I think it's clear when we look at our earliest manuscripts, let's say up through the 4th century, that they tend to preserve the most interesting variants, okay? And that as time goes on, you don't get as many new interesting variants. Okay. Does that make sense? So I think that's one way to say it.
Okay.
But it's definitely not the case that you have more variants early on, for the simple reason that you have fewer manuscripts. And so Ehrman will sometimes say this, and this is just statistically wrong.
Okay, but, hold on. Let me cut you off. You say more variants. This would not be per manuscript. It would be as a whole compiled.
Exactly. Yes. So the more manuscripts you have, the more total variants you have, even though you may have fewer unique variants per manuscript. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's tricky, right? Because you got to think through how these things work statistically. Okay. Yeah. No, that's right.
Let me ask this question. Why is it so difficult to count manuscripts?
Yeah, no, I know. Well, okay. It's you're like, why is it that hard to count? And it's a great question. The answer is because they're spread out all over the place, right? And here's the thing: as New Testament scholars, we come and we just think, I want to know exactly how many there are. Why is this a big deal? Well, if you go to a place like, let's say, the British Library in London, which is a wonderful place, I recommend you going, and you ask them for a New Testament manuscript, they won't know it as a New Testament manuscript. I mean, they do. But if you were to say, can I see manuscript 01? You, as a New Testament scholar, would know that's Codex Sinaiticus. They might not. They know it as Codex Sinaiticus, right? And same thing with P52. If you were to go to Manchester and ask for P52, they would probably know because it's so famous, but they would know it as John Ryland's P whatever it is, the shelf number that it has at the library. So a library may have thousands and thousands of manuscripts, and only a couple of them are New Testament. So what that means is our New Testament manuscripts are spread out all over the world, mostly in European libraries and institutions, but all over the world. And the places that keep them, that house them, that own them, their collections are much bigger than just their handful, or in some cases their single New Testament manuscript. And so, the reality is things happen. They get misplaced, they get reshelved, they get a new number. And so what happens is there's an institute in Germany that tries to keep track of all these, but it's a lot of work to keep tabs on all of them, because they do move around. Sometimes they get sold, so they end up in a different country, a different library, and they get a new shelf number, and you've got to track that down. Sometimes they do get destroyed, right, in wars and things like that. So yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
I can't imagine when we were updating that chapter in evidence, it took an incredible amount of work to do our best, and we still knew that we were given the best estimates we could. And that's one of the advice that you give to apologists is don't say there's 46 of these, but there's roughly 50 or 2 dozen, et cetera.
That's right. And you know from reading the book, there's a chapter on exactly this question, right?
Yep.
How many do we have? And Jacob Peterson, the chapter kind of gets to the end. And as an editor, Sean, I was hoping he would give me an exact number, right? I was like, bro, I want the exact number so I can use this, right? And he didn't give it to me. He was basically like, look, it's probably a fool's errand to try to give an exact number. But he helpfully goes through and explains why it is so hard. And so I just finally, I'm at that point where it's the same thing. I just tell people about 5,300 manuscripts. Manuscripts are over 5,000, because it is hard to keep track down to the 10th, degree.
How are manuscript discoveries made today?
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, the simplest way they're discovered is in big libraries, where they have so much in their library that they either lose track of or don't know what they have. So, for example, Dan Wallace and his organization, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, it's not unusual for them to go and digitize a manuscript, to take photographs of it, and to find that when they get to the back of it, I've had this experience myself, you get to the back of the manuscript and you find that the binding of the manuscript has been made from another manuscript.
That's incredible.
And you spend some time trying to read it, and you figure out, sure enough, hey, this is a New Testament manuscript, and it's never been cataloged by the folks in Germany, right? And when it's most exciting is when you get to tell the librarians, and they don't know. That's when it's really fun. And you get to say, hey, did you know you have this? And they go, oh, no, we never flipped through the whole thing, right? Because they don't have time.
Most of the manuscripts are not archaeological digs. They're not somebody who finds a cave above the Dead Sea.
That's right.
We have these,
That's
and
right.
they just discover them in a new fashion.
That's right. For example, a good example, Sean, is the Mark Fragment. It came out of Oxford. It had been sitting in an Oxford library for over a century and just hadn't been cataloged. If you go there, if you go to the Sackler Library where they have these, they have boxes and boxes full of papyrus that was pulled out of a trash dump in Egypt. And they've tried to go through what they think are the biggest pieces and the most legible pieces and the most interesting ones, but they just have boxes and boxes full of stuff that they haven't been able to catalog yet. So,
do you think it's
amazing.
Unreasonable to conclude that the church altered the manuscripts to fit their theology?
Yeah, I think in some cases it's clear that they did. In individual cases, yes, but as a whole, no, I don't think so at all. So you can find certain variants where you can say, I think, where it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, this variant probably arose because they were trying to solve some theological problem. Okay. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head.
Like 1 John 5:7, would that be an example?
1 John 5:7. Okay. That one I don't think that was created to solve a problem. That was probably more an interpretation of the text.
Okay.
That eventually made its way into the text. Okay. But something, I'll give you an example. In Acts, there is a place where Paul speaks about the church and speaks about the church being God's and God redeeming it with his own blood. And that's theologically a bit awkward, right? Because God, as God, does not have blood, right? In the incarnation, when God takes on flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, now you can talk about blood, okay, and God in the same sentence. But he seems to be speaking about God the Father there, and so there's a couple variants there that do seem designed to kind of clear up the confusion there, okay? And that's a good example of where I would say Scribes did at times think, well, that can't be what the text means. It has to mean this, and so they changed it. And part of this, frankly, is because they lived in a world where everything was copied by hand.
Okay.
So it wasn't hard for a scribe to say to the guy in front of him who copied the manuscript he's working with, you idiot, You see what I'm saying? I mean, all of us, we have our printed Bibles, and we would never think about changing the words. And that's partly a factor of print, But when you live in a world where everything's copied by hand, it's not at all hard to think, well, the guy before me just made a mistake. So I'm not correcting Paul. I'm correcting the scribe that came before me, right? So it's easy to think of these changes nefariously, but I think in most cases, in the vast, vast majority of the cases, these are perfectly innocent, intelligible changes that scribes are making to the text.
One of the chapters that was really helpful in the book is it responded to the claim that we cannot trust the scribes from the first couple centuries because they're not professional scribes.
Yeah.
And the author of this chapter says there's a difference between a professional scribe and a competent scribe.
Correct.
And made a distinction that even like how beautiful some of the paleography is doesn't mean it's actually more accurate.
That's right.
So unpack why we might have good reason as a whole, if you think we do, to trust some of the first scribes in arguably 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. Yeah,
that's good. So again, it gets back to this question of of examining the manuscripts and evaluating the quality of them. Okay, so once you've worked with a lot of manuscripts, you can start to detect the kind of common mistakes that scribes make. And so you look at an early manuscript like P46, which is our earliest copy of Paul's letters, and one of the things we can see is that overall P46, the scribe is copying a very good text of Paul's letters, okay? However, this particular scribe is a bit prone to leaving words out accidentally,
okay,
which is the kind of mistake that all scribes make.
Sure.
It just happens that the scribe of P46 is a bit more prone to it than the average scribe, let's say. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So in cases where P46 doesn't seem to be accidentally leaving words out. P46 is often preserving a very good early text, right?
Okay.
So that's why I think we have to be careful in thinking through untrained or unprofessional doesn't necessarily mean bad. I always use the example of Michael Jordan and LeBron James. Okay.
Now you're talking my language.
I know.
Go ahead.
And now we're going to get into some trouble here, okay, with your audience. Because, like, I've heard Bart Ehrman kind of make this point, like, our later scribes are so good, and therefore our early scribes are bad. That's the impression he gives.
Huh.
And I always say, well, look, is Michael Jordan better than LeBron James? Of course, right? Of course Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James. That doesn't mean LeBron James is bad. See? So do we have some bad early scribes? Yes, we do. P72, I think, not a great manuscript, okay? Codex Beis, I already mentioned, 5th century, not a great manuscript. I wouldn't want to translate an English Bible from Codex Beis, right? But just because later scribes are, in fact, better than early scribes doesn't mean that early scribes are bad.
That's
right?
great.
So,
well, one of the claims that I've made, it's been a number of years, is following popular apologists who have said, even if we had no New Testament manuscripts, we could reconstruct all of the New Testament except for 11 verses. And on their word, I've repeated that line.
Yeah, I know.
There's a chapter in this book where the author traces that down and shows how that myth has gone through century after century. And I read that almost embarrassing, like, God, I can't believe I fell for this. But walk us through what happened and maybe what we can learn from this.
So, the first thing to say is in reading a book like this, you have to remember that God is gracious, right? He's kind to all of us. Who of us has not who of us has not talked about the high priest going into the Holy of Holies and having a rope tied around his ankle, right? Only to learn later that that's not true. And yet the Lord is gracious and uses even our misinformation to help people at times. So that's a common trope. And frankly, it comes from Bruce Metzger. Actually, it comes from Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman. It's still in their 4th edition. So even Bruce Metzger was guilty of peddling this mistake. So you're in good company on this.
Okay.
But yeah, if you track that down, that originates in some 18th century person who wanted to see if this was true, and it's gotten muddled since then, and it comes out as we could reconstruct the whole New Testament even without manuscripts. There's a couple problems with this. One is there's a logical problem, right? Okay. You can't use the church fathers and identify a citation in the New Testament if you don't already know what the New Testament says. You see? So, unless they say, Peter says in 1 Peter 3:5, which they never do because there were no verses yet. How do you know it's 1 Peter 3:5, right? So there's a logical problem here to begin with. But then the bigger problem is actually when we do track down the verses that they cite, it doesn't cover the whole New Testament. It just doesn't. However, I'll say this: the one redeeming feature of that argument is this: the patristic writers do cite the New Testament a lot.
They do.
A lot, right? And the patristic writers can be a really good resource for studying the history of the text and how it was transmitted over time, precisely because we can often put the church fathers in a particular time and place. Does that make sense? So we can often, that's often really helpful in doing text criticism.
Well, one of the things that surprised me, a lot of things surprised me as I was reading this book, is going back to 1993, the number of manuscripts, new manuscripts that are discovered, and how significant they actually are compared to some of the great findings of the past, like, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Could you unpack what some of those over the past couple of decades, what their significance has been or has not been?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the last, there's nothing quite comparable in New Testament terms to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls was just such a massive find, right? There's just so many of them. So there's nothing really comparable to that. The closest thing we might have on the New Testament side is the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus in the 19th century, and the publication of it. That was really significant and has had a significant influence on the discipline. And then maybe since then, the discovery of things like the Chester Beatty Papyri, which is P46, the earliest copy of Paul's letters, one of the earliest copies of Romans, of Revelation, and then P45, a very early copy of the Gospels and Acts. So all these are kind of 2nd, 3rd century in that range, and they're significant precisely because they're so big,
Okay.
Whereas something like P52 is really just a tiny thing.
Big, you mean the size of the manuscript and the amount that it contains?
The amount it contains, that's right. So P46 is almost all of Paul's letters except for the pastorals. And then P45 is, it's fragmentary around the edges, but it's like a lot of the Gospels and Acts, So that's significant because that gives us a good snapshot of what the text looks like in the 2nd and 3rd century and takes us back at least 100 years before things like Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which had been our best witnesses to the text.
We have just a little bit of time here for maybe a handful of questions. Some of you have been asking them throughout the conversation. I've been doing my best to address some of these. If you have any questions I missed or new ones for Dr. Gurry, throw them in there and I will do my best to ask them. But let me ask you this. I realize you're working in academia and I work in academia and I love to popularize stuff for people.
Sure.
If you were going to make a popular argument for the reliability of, say, the New Testament or the Gospels, how would you translate in a way that, number one, people could kind of remember and understand, but that's also accurate and faithful to what textual critics do and what we really know about the reliability of the New Testament? You don't have to lay it all out, but what's maybe one or 2 points you would include and how you'd approach that?
Well, I think, so keep in mind, I'm mainly doing with the text. So it's a bigger question is how do you prove something like the resurrection itself, okay?
Right.
But if it came to the text of the New Testament, I like to go to an example that I worked on in my dissertation of a group of manuscripts that we know that are from the 15th century, some of them.
Okay.
And yet, because of some information in the manuscripts and some other details, we know that their text goes all the way back to the early 7th century, or 8th century, excuse me. No, 7th century. And the reason we know that is because they're so remarkably close. And that's 800 years apart. Over 800 years apart, right? And so I just like to say people just assume that the more you copy something, the worse it gets. It's like the telephone game, right? And that just couldn't be more wrong in my opinion, because scribes didn't just always mess things up. They also fixed things that they messed up, right? And also they could be incredibly competent in copying things well across centuries. And so the main thing that I try to do for people is help debunk this assumption that a lot of modern people have, that if we have a lot of time between things, then certainly the message must have been garbled in between. And that's just not the case when it comes to this. We have clear evidence in the case of this group of manuscripts. We know what the text looked like in the 7th century. We know what it looked like in the 15th. And they're remarkably the same, right? And so if that can happen there's no reason to think that can't happen between the 1st century and the 8th century, from the 8th century to the 16th century, and then from the 16th century to the 21st, right?
Well, that's a modern example, but you would work back from that.
That's right.
To help people understand.
Right.
You cited something really important for apologists, namely that what you're doing with textual criticism isn't arguing that this is true.
That's right.
Simply showing we have this document copied faithfully close to the original. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's another step, right? Another step we have to do in the process of helping people appreciate the New Testament beyond just textual criticism. But if we don't know what the New Testament writers claimed, then there's no point in arguing about whether what they claimed is true or not, right? So textual criticism does that prior work of saying, well, do we know what they actually claim or not? And the answer is, in almost every case, yeah, absolutely. Right.
I think a question popped up that you addressed, but, well, 2. One says, how does Dr. Wallace respond to your book? And by the way, if you notice in small print, it says forward by Daniel Wallace.
Yes.
So he was really gracious towards this, but he also owned some of his mistakes and said, these guys have helped me to be more accurate. So smart move.
Yeah. No, that's right. And Dan, like as I said, he's my mentor and professor at Dallas, so he was very, very gracious in this. And I think this is just helpful for all of us, Sean. We had one scholar that we criticized in the book who's a very senior New Testament scholar. I respect his work enormously and him as a person. And we emailed him about ahead of time to kind of warn him and get his feedback. And brother, I just can't tell you the gracious response that he gave to us. And I replied to him and I said, when I'm at your stage in life, I absolutely want to be that gracious.
Wow.
And I think that's the key for all of us is, look, we all are going to make mistakes. right? So I really hope people do not read this book or think of it in terms of, oh, here's these young guys thinking they've never made a mistake in their life. I hope instead that it's received as saying, when we make mistakes, and we as evangelicals, as apologists, let's own them. Let's have the integrity as Christians, which is what we should have, to say, you know what, I was wrong and I want to do better. I mean, that's what we're all about, right?
Well, that comes through in the book. I think it's a model not only of how to make a better case for the New Testament, but to how to make correction yourself and to others and own when we've made mistakes. And I own it reading this book. And I could see you guys own it reading through this book. And you know what? I had to ask myself, do I love truth? That's ultimately what this is about.
Right.
And if I'm peddling things that aren't true, that undermines the nature of our faith.
That's right.
So,
and that's one of the reasons why, Sean, we wanted to write this book. We kind of styled it as self-corrective, because we said, look, either we can wait for the Bart Ehrmans of the world to call us out on this, or we can do it ourselves, right? We can do it ourselves. But somebody's, and the fascinating thing is we've heard from some apologists who've said this. They've been like, I've been in a debate with an atheist and they called me out on my bad stats.
Wow.
And it really did discredit me and hurt my credibility. So I think we help ourselves in the long run. It is painful, but the Bible says faithful are the wounds of a friend. And that's kind of the aim is, okay, how can we do better as a church, right?
So let me kind of wrap it up this way. And there's a few other questions. I think we got to most of them here, but I think in the minds of some people, the further we move away from the events of Jesus, the less confidence we have that we can reconstruct the words. As a whole, I think you're saying it's actually the opposite because of the techniques of textual criticism.
That's right.
Is that fair?
That's right. Think in terms of Martin Luther, okay, in the 16th century, launching the Reformation, and he is using a good printed edition of the Greek New Testament. And mine is better. Like, I just have no hesitation saying my printed Greek New Testament is better than the one that Luther used. So if Luther's New Testament, which is not as good as mine, was good enough for the Reformation, how much better ground am I on now, right? How much more should I be confident to proclaim the good news of the gospel and the message of the New Testament today, when we do have, I think, better manuscripts, we have better scholarship, a lot. It's not perfect. We still have work to do in text criticism. I have no problem admitting that. But I just think overall, I have no problem saying I have a better Greek New Testament than Martin Luther did. And my question is, do I proclaim the gospel half as clearly as he did? And if I don't, that's a rebuke to me, not to textual criticism. You know
what? I apologize, but I have one more for you. I realize you're not a prophet, and like me, you work at a nonprofit organization, a seminary. But I have to know, if you made predictions, and I realize this is dangerous, 2, 5, 10 years, how do you see textual criticism changing and adapting in some of the new challenges coming up?
Well, I think the most important thing as a discipline is that we're going to continue to leverage the power of computers. And some people maybe listening have heard of big data in the corporate world. And I think text critics are going to hopefully get better and better at using big data in textual criticism. And the key with data always is, it's great to have it, but it's better to be able to use it wisely. And so I think the computer is going to be one of the key ways we will continue to discover new manuscripts, and hopefully that will help us as well, and refine our methods and revisit textual problems that have been real conundra for us, and hopefully resolve those and get better Bibles than we've had before.
I think part of the exciting thing to me is that you have dove into this with a commitment to the truth, which I love. Not diving into it as an apologist, but saying, what's the truth that's here? And I think you'd agree with me that even if we got rid of all of our texts right now and New Testament textual criticism stopped today, as a textual critic, you say we have confidence in a high degree of the New Testament. Is that correct?
Sean, I would be out of a job, so I cannot answer that question. But yes. I mean, this is what I say. If you want to pick up a Greek New Testament from 50 years ago, one of my favorite Greek New Testaments was published in 1881. I'd have no problem basing my faith on that. And same with the one that Luther used. I'd have no problem basing my faith on that. Again, can we do better than what Luther used? Yes, we can, and so we should. But what Luther used was more than enough for what he needed, and what we have is more than enough for what we need.
That's great. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. I really want to encourage our viewers to get a copy of your book, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. I'll hold it up there for a second just so you don't miss it. Apologists, you've heard from pastors, heard from skeptics and critics. thanking them just because you have a commitment to accuracy. That's really commendable. So I was thrilled that both me and Clay Jones, although you had some corrections in there as a whole, saw us trying to do good work. And that's what we're committed to at Biola. So those of you who are watching, we are committed at Biola. We'd love to help train you. This is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. We have a certificate program. There's a discount code in the bottom. Or if you've ever thought about getting a master's degree, come think about studying with me at Biola. And we need to get you to come teach a class on this at some point in the future. Let's talk about that.
Preferably in the summer, in like July, Sean, when it's about 120 degrees here. That would be the great time for me to come out to Biola.
I will see what I can do for you.
I appreciate that.
Pick up Peter's book. Also, you're on Twitter. Follow him on Twitter. You do some regular updates, which is helpful to me. And your blog. What's the address for your blog so people can track?
So the blog I contribute to is called Evangelical Textual Criticism. And the URL is a bit long because it's on Blogger. So the easiest thing is just to Google it and it'll come right up for you.
Say it one more time. Evangelical Textual Criticism.
You got it.
And your name, it'll come up. I follow your blog, and it helps me stay in touch with some of the scholarly world.
Yeah, it's a great blog.
So, hey, again, thank you, brother, for your work. Thanks for coming on. This has really been a treat. And for those of you who viewed, I see people from all over the world. Trust this has been enjoyable and helpful to you. When it airs, if you want to share it with somebody else, that would help what we're doing here at Biola Apologetics as well. So thanks so much. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks a lot, Sean.
You bet.